we were training in a camp in La Manga at the time, and Glenn had decided he was going to name his squad on the last day of that camp, really, or the penultimate day. And the players had some free time, and then we were given appointments to go and meet with the manager, and you've basically found out whether you were going or whether you weren't. But as it turned out, the guys that weren't going were given appointments early in that block, so that they were then flown home pretty soon after they'd had their meeting. So it was a very difficult situation for everybody. There's no easy way of delivering that news to a squad of players. I've seen some managers name their squad right from the start, and then standby players are with the group, and other managers do it the way Glenn did it, in terms of naming a bigger squad and then cutting it down. But of course there's huge disappointment for those players, and I'd have to say with Paul at that time, he had a good season, but also was struggling a bit in the games in the lead up to that decision. We went to Morocco and played 2 matches in Morocco, and he wasn't at his best. I don't think anybody could say he was at his best at that time.
Do you think it was probably the right call from Glenn?
I think so. I think at that time, Paul physically wasn't at the highest level. And it was a brave call from the manager, because in all my time with England, 10 years playing across sort of 3 different teams almost, Gascoigne was the most talented player we had. And I don't think it's any coincidence that we made 2 semi-finals in 1990 and 1996, and Gascoigne was in the team for both.
How would you describe Glenn Hoddle's management style?
Well, I felt that Glenn was a coach who had tremendous belief in what was possible for the players, a style of play that I think everybody enjoyed playing in. He wanted to express ourselves with the ball. He wanted us to be a mirror of how he was as a player, and I suppose the difficulty for us was we could never be quite as good as he was as a player. So I know as a player, I felt he had more belief in me than I had in myself. He always wanted to encourage you to play from the back. We played with a back 3 from his very first game, right the way through until really we went into extra time against Argentina, where we were down to 10 men and we went to a back 4. Every other game I played with Glenn was a back 3. So, people will talk about the way he managed players and relationships with players, but I think his strengths were his tactical awareness and the way that he had a clear plan of how he wanted the team to play.
Tony Adams said in his book that he felt Glenn was excessively hard on David Beckham. Did you see that or feel that?
I think it would be interesting to know how David felt about that. I think at the time David probably felt that way. There seemed to be a lot going on in David's world at that time. He was just starting to, his relationship with Victoria was becoming more serious, and I remember him, meeting her early in the tournament. So Glenn had taken a decision that, he wasn't going to play him in the first match, which was a big story, really. And ironically, he didn't start Michael Owen in that first game either. So when you look back at the narrative of the tournament, for those 2 players to be left out of the game against Tunisia is remarkable in hindsight. Again, I think we had a good team and we had good competition for places. And although it was probably a surprise that David didn't start the first game, because he'd started most of the games for Glenn, if not all, it wasn't a decision that the whole camp was shocked. It was a bigger decision and a bigger surprise that Glenn left Gascoigne out of the 23, probably than that he left David out of that first game, I think.
By contrast to the question mark over David and how he was treated and his status at this point, what did you know about, what was your view of Michael Owen at this point, who came as the wonder kid, the 18-year-old, big impact for Liverpool? What was your view of him at that point?
Well, we had 2 players in Beckham and Owen, well, 3 if you include Scholes, who had really emerged over the previous 2 years, and had shown fearless play really with their clubs and for England. And Michael was probably the last of those to emerge, the last of those 3. So it was very early stages of him establishing himself in the Premier League. And again, we had a sort of tried and trusted partnership in terms of Sheringham and Shearer, and Paul Scholes as another option to play off of the front. I remember actually after the first game with Tunisia, Teddy Sheringham and myself were the 2 numbers drawn for the doping control, and we sort of went and sat in the room, and because of the heat and everything, you're in there for about an hour. And then we were saying, what a shame that everybody can't play a part and feel that they've been part of it. And I remember Teddy saying, he felt sorry for a couple of the players, and Michael being one of them. And of course, within 2 days, Michael was in the team, Teddy was out of the team, I was out of the team, and Gary Neville was in the team. So we'd sat feeling sorry for everybody else, and I'd be interested to know if they were as sorry for us after.
Just from your perspective, that Tunisia game, very important in your life and career. What was it like lining up at the start of that game in Marseille?
Yeah, very special to be in the starting 11 for the first game in a World Cup. It's what you've dreamed of all of your life, really. My earliest memories of football were always watching England, really. There were only England internationals and FA Cup finals that were shown live on television. So to then be one of 56, 60 million people, one of 11 representing them is a very, very proud moment. And the whole occasion in Marseille with the colour and the heat and everything else was as you imagine a World Cup to be. So was a very, very proud moment.
Moving forward in the tournament, what went wrong against Romania?
Well, obviously I'd got injured in the game before, I missed it, so that was one thing. We had played well against Tunisia. Unfortunately, I got injured the day after the Tunisia game in a freak incident on the training ground. So we had to make a change to the team, which I know Glenn wasn't happy about. And Romania had some good players. You're talking a Romanian team with Hagi and Popescu and Petrescu and lots of very, very good players. So this wasn't a team that were a walkover by any means, and Romania played very well on the night. We couldn't quite finish our chances, and it just showed the jeopardy that exists in a World Cup. You look at the names, and the public look at the names when the draw is made, and they assume certain games are a win and certain games are more difficult, and it's never as straightforward as it looks.
It put extra pressure on the final group game, the Colombia game, and Glenn made the big changes that the public was sort of clamouring for. Can you remember the kind of build up to that game and the sense of significance of that moment?
Yeah, I think normally in a tournament, your third group game is pivotal. It's very few teams go through the group after 2 matches. The Germans normally do, but everybody else has to wait until the third. I remember travelling to the ground, and David in particular, you felt had a point to prove and was determined to prove that point. He looked in a very good place mentally ahead of that game. And so when he scored the free kick, it wasn't a huge surprise. We'd seen him practice that skill and execute that skill time after time on the training pitch. And so you have confidence then when he's in that situation in a game that he's going to deliver. So, we were aware that Colombia had some good players. Obviously, all the focus was on Valderrama at that time. Whether they were as strong a team as we might have believed, I'm not so certain. But again, the team played well that day and certainly deserved the win.
The finishing second in the group, meant that our denouement was coming earlier than we might have liked. Argentina in the round of 16. Did the players, who were relatively young, many of them, understand the context of an England-Argentina game, the significance of it historically? Did they get that?
Yeah, I think that enough of the players were alive when the Falklands War was on. We were aware of the game in 1966 at Wembley. So there were some old stages in the team who would have passed on what those games meant. Who would have passed on their previous experiences of playing against Argentina, and of course we'd had the game in '86 as well in Mexico that none of the players were directly involved in, but the likes of Stuart Pearce had crossed over that period with players like John Barnes and Gary Lineker who'd been involved that day. So the tales are kind of passed through the dressing room informally without people sitting down, and you knew what it meant to the public, a game of that importance.
How strong did you think that particular Argentina team was?
Well, there's no question that in Ortega at that time and Batistuta, they had two players that you felt were really capable of doing anything and really high talent in front of goal. They also then had good defenders. You expected them to defend well, although ironically you could look back at Michael's goal and question that. We knew this was probably a game better billed as a quarter-final or a semi-final even than it was a second round match.
We went and spoke to Juan Sebastian Veron recently about this, and he says this is the best game he ever played in. Did you you started on the bench? Sorry, were you fully fit then? Could you have started? Was there a question?
No, I think the turnaround of games was so quick that I was able to declare myself fit, having had an ankle ligament injury, and I think, like all players, you declare yourself fit, but you're probably not fully fit. So you have that moment of the team being named, you're not in it, irritable, but really recognising, okay, it's a fair call, and actually, managed to come into the game after 70 minutes. So to watch the narrative of the game unfold in the first 45 minutes alone was spectacular, really.